She could barely breathe. Each gasp tore through her throat like fire, and the sound of the rope creaked above her head. Slow, merciless, alive. Clara Wren hung from an old oak in the middle of the forest, wrists bound wide apart, the rough fiber biting deep into her skin. Her toes brushed the cold air, reaching for a ground that wasn't there. Every time her knees gave in, the noose tugged tighter, stealing another breath. The night was heavy with silence. No wind, no birds, only the faint rhythm of her struggling heart. A lantern flickered nearby, casting long shadows across the dirt. And in that trembling light stood a man she once called her husband, Silas Boone. Once he'd sworn to protect her. Now he leaned against the tree, bottle in hand, watching, as if the scene before him was nothing but a cruel joke. His voice was quiet, almost tender. "You always said you wanted to be free, Clara. Well, here you are." Her lips trembled. No scream came out, just a whisper swallowed by the night. The rope creaked again, and pain shot down her arms like lightning. Her mind began to fade, memories melting into the darkness. The laughter of a younger life, the promise of love turned into chains.
And then a sound. At first, she thought it was her heartbeat, but it grew louder, boots crunching over leaves, slow and steady. Someone was out there. The bottle slipped from Silas's hand and shattered. He turned toward the noise, squinting into the dark. Clara's breath hitched. Hope and terror twisted inside her chest. Whoever was coming, it could mean salvation or something worse. But the forest wasn't silent anymore. Someone was coming. Before we find out what happens next, tell me, what time is it where you're listening from? And if you want to ride along for more tales of courage, subscribe now. Now, let's see what waited for them in the dark. The forest was still dark when Elias Crowe heard it, the faint, uneven groan of a rope swaying in the wind. He stopped beside his horse, hand resting on the worn leather reins. For years, he had learned not to listen. The frontier was full of ghosts calling for help that never came. But this sound, it didn't feel like a ghost. It felt alive. He followed it through the trees, boots sinking into the damp earth. A pale light from a fallen lantern led him to the clearing, and that was when he saw her.
A woman, hanging limp from the oak, her body trembling against the pull of gravity. For a moment, he couldn't move. The sight clawed at something buried deep in him, a memory he'd spent years trying to forget. With a single motion, Elias drew his knife and cut the rope. The sound snapped through the air like thunder. The woman collapsed into his arms, breath ragged, her face streaked with dirt and tears. He knelt, pressing 2 fingers to her neck. A pulse, weak but there. "Easy now," he murmured, his voice low, steady as the river in winter. "You're still here." Her lips parted, barely forming words. "Please, just make it quick." He froze. The plea wasn't anger, it was surrender. Something inside him twisted. The soldier in him wanted to walk away, but the man who'd buried too many names couldn't. He lifted her carefully, wrapping his coat around her shoulders. The smell of smoke clung to the fabric. Old fire, old sins. By the time dawn broke, Elias had carried her to his horse. Behind them, the forest slowly exhaled, the wind whispering through the leaves like a benediction. He didn't look back at the clearing. He didn't need to. He knew what he'd find, an empty rope swaying in the morning light. As he placed her gently across the saddle, her eyes fluttered open for a heartbeat. Who are you?" she whispered. Elias hesitated, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "No one worth remembering," he said. Then he mounted, guiding the horse toward the rising sun. He didn't know her name. He didn't know what had been done to her. And he didn't know that by cutting that rope, he had tied himself to a storm he couldn't escape. He had no idea that saving her would cost him everything.
By the time the sun cleared the ridge, the world had turned gold. Dust swirled around the horse's hooves as Elias guided it across the ridge, one arm steadying the woman in front of him. She was barely conscious, head against his chest, breath shallow, hands trembling under the weight of exhaustion. They reached a stream cutting through the valley. Elias stopped, lowering her gently to the ground. She coughed, her voice raw but alive. Where are we?" "Far enough to breathe," he said, "not far enough to rest." She turned her head, studying the stranger's weathered face. "You coulda left me there," he shrugged, tightening the bandage on his arm. "Coulda," he said quietly, "but I didn't." The silence between them stretched, soft, uneasy. The river murmured, birds stirred, and for a fleeting moment peace felt possible. But peace doesn't last long out here. Behind them, somewhere in the dark timber miles away, Silas Boone found the rope lying in the dirt. It was cut clean through. His jaw tightened, eyes burning like coal. "She didn't die," he muttered. "She didn't die." He turned to his men, 3 riders, rough and mean as the land itself. "Find them, bring her back." The sound of hooves carried across the canyon. Elias looked up sharply. Years on the frontier had taught him that kind of silence meant only one thing. Someone was hunting. He reached for his rifle, loading it with deliberate calm. "We have to move," he said. Clara tried to stand, but her legs buckled. He caught her before she fell. "I can't," she whispered. "I don't have anything left." "You've got one thing," he said, "a heartbeat. That's enough." He lifted her onto the horse again, swung into the saddle, and kicked off down the trail. The wind picked up, carrying the dry scent of gunpowder that hadn't yet been fired. From the ridge behind them came the first echo of a shout, then a gunshot. The bullet hissed past and shattered a branch beside them. "Down!" Elias barked, leaning low over the horse's neck. The chase was on. The valley roared with the thunder of hooves, gunfire cracking through the air. Clara clung to him, eyes wide with fear, every jolt of the saddle shaking her sore body. Elias fired once over his shoulder. The shot kicked up dust near one of the riders, buying them seconds, but seconds were never enough. The trail narrowed into a ravine. The horse stumbled, regained its footing. Another shot grazed Elias's sleeve, tearing through the cloth. He hissed, pressing his hand to the burn beneath. They broke out onto open land, a stretch of sun-bleached grass leading to the far hills. The wind screamed in their ears. "Hold on," he shouted. For a moment, the world became pure motion, dust, breath, sky, and fear. Then came silence. The gunfire faded. The riders' voices grew distant. They'd lost them, at least for now. Elias slowed the horse, guiding it toward a cluster of rocks by the ridge. He slid off, wincing as his boots hit the ground. Blood darkened the fabric near his ribs, but he said nothing. Clara slid down beside him, shaking. "You're hurt." "Not the worst I've had," he muttered. Why are they chasing us?" He looked at her, eyes steady, voice low. "You tell me." She hesitated, gaze falling to the ground. "Because I stopped belonging to him." The words hung in the air, simple, heavy, final. Elias nodded slowly. "Then he's not chasing us. He's chasing what he's already lost." She met his eyes, and for the first time since the forest, something like trust flickered there. He thought he'd saved her, but this was only the beginning of a darker fight. Night crept over the valley, slow and merciless. Elias guided the horse into an abandoned ranch house, half swallowed by weeds and dust. The roof sagged, windows shattered, but the walls still stood, strong enough to keep out the wind. He helped Clara down. She could barely stand, her skin pale under the moonlight. Inside, the air smelled of smoke and thyme. A rusted lantern still hung by the door, its glass cracked. "This place," Elias murmured. "I've been here before." He didn't explain, but his hands trembled as he set down his rifle. Clara noticed the way he looked at the burned floorboards, how his eyes lingered, not on the danger outside, but on something that had already died long ago. She found an old box near the hearth. Inside lay a half-melted cross of iron, blackened by flame. She held it up to the light. "This belonged to you?" Elias hesitated. "To someone I couldn't save." Then, quieter, "I stopped believing after that night." Clara placed the cross on the table between them. "Maybe belief isn't something you lose," she said softly. "Maybe it just waits for you to need it again." He said nothing. Outside, the wind howled through the cracks like a warning. Far off, the Boone gang rode through the dark, their torches flickering like angry stars. Silas Boone's voice carried above the storm. "She's mine. The man with her dies slow." The sound of their hooves reached the cabin before the light did. Elias grabbed his rifle, checked the chamber. "They found us." He turned to Clara. "Back wall. There's a hatch under the floor. If I fall, you run." She shook her head. "Not again. You don't get to argue. I already did." The first bullet tore through the doorframe, splintering the wood. Elias ducked behind the table, returning fire. The echo filled the cabin, thunder rolling off the walls. Clara crawled behind a beam, heart hammering in her chest. Through the cracks, she saw 3 riders fanning out across the yard. One lit a torch and hurled it through the broken window. The curtains caught immediately. "Fire!" Elias shouted. Smoke poured through the room, thick and choking. He fired again, dropping one shadow near the barn. But the heat was rising fast. Flames climbed the walls, licking the ceiling beams. The roof groaned. "Elias," Clara coughed, "we have to go." Not yet. Another shot, another crash. A beam split and fell. Elias dove, shoving her clear, but the impact drove him into the floor. Wood collapsed over his shoulder. "Go!" he barked, pushing against the burning debris. Clara grabbed his arm, pulling with everything she had. The smoke stung her eyes, the air burning her lungs. "Not without you!" She reached for the rifle, found it half buried near the ashes. Her fingers shook as she lifted it.
Outside, a rider kicked the door open, firelight framing his silhouette. Clara steadied the gun. For a heartbeat, the world went still, the only sound her breath, the crackle of wood, the whisper of her own fear. Then she fired. The bullet struck the wall inches above the rider's head, shattering the lantern he held. Flames spilled backward, engulfing the porch in sparks. The men outside cursed, retreating into the dark. Inside, the roof gave a final groan. Elias pulled free, coughing hard. "That was a warning shot?" "I wasn't aiming to miss," she said, voice raw but steady. They stumbled out through the back door, smoke chasing them into the open. The night air hit like ice. Behind them, the cabin burned, orange and violent against the black sky. They collapsed by a fallen fence, lungs heaving. The fire's glow flickered in their eyes, painting their faces gold. Elias looked back once. "Everything I owned was in there." Clara leaned beside him. "Then it's time to start over." He gave a dry laugh, somewhere between pain and gratitude. "You talk like someone who's used to losing things." She looked toward the flames.
You only lose what you can't forgive. For a long while, neither spoke. The fire burned down to embers, the air heavy with smoke and the scent of pine. Above them, the stars blinked, indifferent, eternal. Clara turned the cross in her hand, its edges still warm from the blaze. Maybe this survived for a reason. Elias glanced at her, then at the sky. Maybe. The wind shifted, carrying the faint sound of horses again, far but not gone. The Boone gang wasn't finished. He stood, steadying himself despite the limp in his leg. "We keep moving. East, toward Dust Creek. They won't expect that."
She nodded, slipping the cross into her pocket. But the night wasn't done testing them. By the time they reached Dust Creek, the sun was setting behind the hills, orange bleeding into violet, the kind of light that made the world look gentler than it was. The town was quiet, half asleep. Windmills turned slow above roofs made of tin and prayer. Elias reined in his horse outside the old blacksmith's shop. His side still ached from the night before, but he said nothing. Clara climbed down first, her face pale, her eyes fixed on the street that led toward the saloon.
"This is where he'll come," she said. "You sure you want to face him? I've been running since the day I met him. It ends here." Elias studied her for a moment. "You don't owe him anything." She shook her head. "It's not about him. It's about who I am when I stop being afraid." He looked at her, really looked, and something in her steadiness silenced every argument he had. "You saved me once," she said. "Let me save myself this time." Elias nodded slowly. "Then I'll watch your back." That night, Dust Creek slept beneath a heavy moon. The saloon lights flickered dim through cracked windows, the piano long gone silent. Elias waited by the edge of town, rifle across his lap. Inside, Clara stood alone in the half-lit room. Her hands trembled, but her gaze was steady on the doorway. Every creak of the wind outside felt like the echo of her past. And then he came. Silas Boone stepped through the door like a shadow that refused to fade. His coat was torn, his face smeared with dust, but the same cruel grin lived on his lips. "Well," he drawled, "didn't think you'd have the spine to show up." Clara's voice was calm. "I'm not hiding anymore." He laughed, low and mean.
"You think that cowboy can save you? He's already half dead." "I don't need saving," she said. "Not from him, not from you." Silas took a step closer, hand drifting toward his holster. "You belong to me, Clara." Her eyes didn't waver. "You'll never own me again." The moment hung still. One breath, two. Then Silas drew. The flash lit the room white. A gunshot cracked through the silence, echoing down the street. Elias was already moving before the sound faded, kicking open the saloon doors. Silas was on the floor, his gun clattering away. Clara stood over him, smoke curling from the pistol in her shaking hands. Elias froze at the sight, not of her fear, but of her strength. Silas groaned, clutching his side, eyes wide with hate. "You'll regret this." Elias picked up the fallen revolver, cocked it once, then leveled it at Silas's chest. For a heartbeat, all the noise of the world vanished. He saw flashes of every man he'd ever buried, faces of war, of vengeance, of choices that never stopped bleeding. His finger tightened on the trigger. And then he stopped. The sound of Clara's voice cut through the haze. "Elias," she whispered, "don't." He lowered the gun.
The breath he'd been holding slipped out slow, heavy as a confession. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "mercy is the hardest bullet to fire." He stepped back. Let the law take what's left of him. Silas tried to rise, but his strength was gone. The sheriff's lantern glowed at the door. Someone had heard the shot. The law was coming. For once, justice didn't wear a gun. Clara turned to Elias, tears glinting but not of sorrow. "You could have ended him." Elias met her gaze. "I did." Outside, the wind carried the first chill of dawn. The two walked out into the empty street, side by side. Behind them, the saloon door swung slow, creaking like the last sigh of a bad dream. The stars began to fade, and the first light of morning spilled across Dust Creek, pale, clean, and forgiving. And for the first time, neither of them was running. Morning came softly to Dust Creek.
The storm had passed, leaving behind a sky brushed with gold and lavender. The old blacksmith's shop stood quiet, its windows catching the first light of day. Inside, a kettle hissed gently over the small stove, and the smell of iron and smoke mixed with something new: peace. Elias sat by the window, his shoulder wrapped in clean cloth. Each breath came slower now, steadier. Clara moved quietly behind him, refilling the cup of coffee that had long gone cold. Her hands were still rough from rope and road, but they didn't tremble anymore. He glanced back at her. "You don't have to keep fussing." She smiled faintly. "I'm not fussing. I'm finishing what you started." They sat in silence for a while, the kind of silence that doesn't need filling. Outside, a pair of doves perched on the rail of the fence, cooing into the wind. Clara's gaze drifted to the street, still and empty under the new sun. "You could have killed him," she said quietly. Elias didn't answer right away. He traced the rim of his mug with a finger, then looked up at the light creeping across the floorboards. "A man who forgives," he said finally, "rides lighter." The words hung there, simple, steady, true. Clara let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. For the first time in years, she smiled, not out of relief, but something deeper: gratitude, release. They spent the rest of the morning outside, mending the broken corral behind a shop. The wood was old, dry, and cracked, but together they made it stand again. Each hammer strike echoed against the hills like a heartbeat returning after too long in the dark. When they finished, Elias leaned on the post, wiping the sweat from his brow. "This the same place?" he asked. Clara nodded. "Right here. This is where he—" She paused, then shook her head. "No, this is where it ended." He smiled, just a hint, the kind that doesn't reach the lips but softens the eyes. "Then let's make sure something better begins." They built a small shelter for the horses. She laughed when he tried to lift a beam with one good arm. He laughed too, the sound rusty, uncertain, like a man relearning what laughter feels like. By noon, the shop had come alive again. The anvil caught the sun. The wind carried the scent of pine and dust, and for once it didn't feel like loneliness. It felt like freedom. Clara sat on the step, watching the horizon. "What now?" she asked. Elias shrugged. "I'll stay till the horses stop limping. After that, maybe I'll ride north." "And me?" "You?" He smiled gently. "You've got a town to rebuild. A name to live without fear." She looked at him, eyes bright in the afternoon light. "You think a soul can really start over?" Elias stared toward the horizon where the sun burned low and kind. "That's all any of us ever do, start over, one sunrise at a time." A soft wind swept through the open door, stirring the dust, the cross she'd set on the table glinting faintly in the light. Clara reached out, touching it just once. No prayer, no words, just gratitude. The day faded slow, the way good days do. And when the shadows stretched long across the valley, Elias poured 2 cups of coffee, handing one to her. "To what's gone," he said. She raised hers. "And to what's still here." They drank in quiet companionship as the sun slipped beyond the ridge. Somewhere, a church bell rang from the far end of the town, calling the day to rest. For the first time in a long time, Dust Creek slept in peace. And as night folded gently over the land, the old rancher closed his eyes, knowing that forgiveness, his and hers, had turned the rope of yesterday into a bridge for tomorrow. The night had returned, but this time it wasn't cruel. Lantern lights spilled through the window of the old forge, soft and golden, swaying with the wind. Clara sat beside the fire, eyes half closed, listening to the slow, even rhythm of Elias's breathing. For once, there was no sound of pursuit, no fear in the corners. Only stillness, the kind that comes after storms, when the world remembers how to be quiet again. She looked at him, that weathered man who had walked through his own ashes to save a stranger.
Somewhere along the way, their wounds have become mirrors of one another, two broken things finding balance in grace. Outside, the prairie stretched endless under a sky full of stars. Each one flickered like a promise, faint but real. Maybe, she thought, salvation doesn't come from miracles at all. Maybe it comes from ordinary kindness, the kind that holds on when everything else lets go. Elias stirred, opening his eyes. "You ever think about what happens next?" she asked. He smiled, the kind of smile that carried both weight and peace. "Tomorrow happens," he said. "That's enough." She nodded, her gaze drifting to the horizon where dawn waited, quiet and certain. And maybe he was right.
Maybe the strongest rope isn't the one that binds, but the one that saves. And now, friend, if you've stayed with this story until the end, I want to ask you something. If you were Elias standing in that dusty saloon, would you have pulled the trigger or chosen mercy? Because out here, in the true Wild West, justice doesn't always wear a badge, and kindness, more often than not, carries the heavier gun. If this story touched your heart, give it a like and subscribe for more true Wild West stories of courage, redemption, and second chances. And tell me, what time is it where you're listening from tonight? Maybe it's morning in Texas, or dusk in Cornwall, or midnight somewhere far away. Wherever you are, I hope this tale left you a little lighted and reminded you that even in the harshest lands, grace still rides among us. So pour yourself a cup of coffee, or tea if you prefer, and rest easy, partner. There's another story waiting just beyond the hills.